Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. Today, we're going to read The Keeping Quilt by Patricia Polacco. Before I read a book, I always like to study the illustration, which you can see on your screen. I always like to look at the awards and the title, and I also like to flip the book over and take a look at what's on the back. So right away, just looking at the front cover, I notice that there's people. They look very friendly and happy together. I also notice that some are older and some are younger. One's way younger. I notice that they're all looking at this really pretty quilt. And the quilt kind of stands out because they're all wearing brown and white or cream colored clothing. But the quilt is all different colors. Blue and green and red and orange, and it has different shapes on it. It's really beautiful. I also notice the title is The Keeping Quilt, and that's a quilt. So there must be something very important about this quilt. The award says that it's the Sidney Taylor Award from the Association of Jewish Libraries. So this must be a book that includes things about Jewish traditions, which is really neat. And it got an award for it, so it must be a really good book. Now, if I look on the back, I see people who, they might not be the same people, but they look similar. They're definitely wearing similar clothing. Oh, let me show you the back so you can see it. There you go. They're definitely wearing similar clothing. And there's a little note up at the top. It says, "This book has become almost as important to me as the quilt itself. It is a wonderful way to not only introduce my remarkable family, but also demonstrate their personal triumphs, disappointments, and their ever-powerful love that has reached across 6 generations and an ocean of time." And that was written by Patricia Polacco, who's the author and the illustrator of this book. That means she wrote the words and she drew the pictures. She's very talented. When I look at what I just read, I realize it says she's introducing her remarkable family. So this is a story about her family. And it also says 6 generations. So this is a story about her family over time. I wonder what the quilt has to do with that. This is exciting. Now that I've looked at the front and the back of the book, I'm even more excited to get started on reading this great book. So let's begin. Before I start, I want to tell you that sometimes Patricia's beautiful illustrations span over 2 pages like this. And in that case, I really want to show you the whole thing. So I do that. In the slide, you'll see the whole picture. But what happened was you can't see the words very well when I do that. So just trust me. I'll read the words. You enjoy the picture. And then on the next slide, I'll zoom in on this page. And on the slide after that, I'll zoom in on that page. That way, you get to study the beautiful illustrations while also getting a chance to maybe reread the words in your head or out loud. Got it? Okay. The Keeping Quilt by Patricia Polacco. The Keeping Quilt. Oh, this is a nice picture. This is showing a ship of people who are immigrating to the United States of America. And the first thing that they saw when they immigrated to the United States of America was the Statue of Liberty. That was right near Ellis Island, which was the place where they had to go before they could come into the United States. The Keeping Quilt by Patricia Polacco. My face is a little bit in the way of this one, so I'm going to read it in the book that I have in my hands, and you'll be able to read it when I flip the slide. Okay, sit back, relax, and enjoy this book. When my great-grandma Anna came to America, she wore the same thick overcoat and big boots she had worn for farm work, but her family weren't dirt farmers anymore. In New York City, her father's work was hauling things on a wagon, and the rest of the family made artificial flowers all day. Everyone was in a hurry, and it was so crowded. Not like back home Russia, but all the same, it was their home, and most of their neighbors were just like them. You can see a close-up of that page. Patricia's such a good artist. And just as promised, here's the page where my face was in the way of and you couldn't read very well. I'll give you a minute to read it. When Anna went to school, English sounded to her like pebbles dropping into shallow water. Shh, shh, shh. In 6 months, she was speaking English. Her parents almost never learned, so she spoke English for them too. The only things she had left of back home Russia were her dress and the babushka she liked to throw up into the air when she was dancing. And her dress was getting too small. After her mother had sewn her a new one, she took her old dress and babushka. Then, from a basket of old clothes, she took Uncle Vladimir's shirt, Aunt Havela's nightdress, and an apron of Aunt Natasha's. "We will make a quilt to help us always remember home," Anna's mother said. "It will be like having the family in back home Russia dance around us at night." And there's a beautiful illustration of her family in back home Russia, there in spirit. And so it was. Anna's mother invited all the neighborhood ladies. They cut out animals and flowers from the scraps of clothing. Anna kept the needles threaded and handed them to the ladies as they needed them. The border of the quilt was made of Anna's babushka. You read it. On Friday nights, Anna's mother would say the prayers that started the Sabbath. The family ate challah and chicken soup. The quilt was the tablecloth. Anna grew up and fell in love with great-grandpa Sasha. To show he wanted to be her husband, he gave Anna a gold coin, a dried flower, and a piece of rock salt, all tied into a linen handkerchief. The gold was for wealth, the flower for love, and the salt so their lives would have flavor. She accepted the hanky. They were engaged. Under the wedding huppah, Anna and Sasha promised each other love and understanding. After the wedding, the men and women celebrated separately. You read it. I can move my face a little bit. When my grandma Carl was born, Anna wrapped her daughter in the quilt to welcome her warmly into the world. Carl was given a gift of gold, flour, salt, and bread. Gold, so she would never know poverty. A flower, so she would always know love. Salt, so her life would always have flavor. And bread, so that she would never know hunger. Carl learned to keep the Sabbath and to cook and clean and do washing. "Married you'll be someday," Anna told Carl. And Again, the quilt became a wedding hapa, this time for Carl's wedding to Grandpa George. Men and women celebrated together, but they still did not dance together. In Carl's wedding bouquet was a gold coin, bread, and salt. Carl and George moved to a farm in Michigan, and great-grandma Anna came to live with them. The quilt once again wrapped a new little girl, Mary Ellen. Mary Ellen called Anna Lady Grandma. She had grown very old and was sick a lot of the time. The quilt kept her legs warm. On Anna's 98th birthday, the cake was a kulik, a rich cake with raisins and candied fruit in it. When great-grandma Anna died, prayers were said to lift her soul to heaven. My mother, Mary Ellen, was now grown up. You read it. When Mary Ellen left home, she took the quilt with her. When she became a bride, the quilt became her hapa. For the first time, friends who were not Jews came to the wedding. My mother wore a suit, but in her bouquet were gold, bread, and salt. The quilt welcomed me, Patricia, into the world. And it was the tablecloth for my first birthday party. At night, I would trace my fingers around the edges of each animal on the quilt before I went to sleep. I told my mother stories about the animals on the quilt. She told me whose sleeve had made the horse, whose apron had made the chicken, whose dress had made the flowers, and whose babushka went around the edge of the quilt. The quilt was a pretend cape when I was in the bull ring, or sometimes a tent in the steaming Amazon jungle. At my wedding to Enzo Mario, men and women danced together. In my bouquet were gold, bread, and salt, and a sprinkle of wine, so I would always know laughter. You read it. "20 years ago, I held Tracy Denise in the quilt for the first time. Someday, she too will leave home, and she will take the quilt with her." The end. Thanks for joining me. This was The Keeping Quilt by Patricia Polacco. I loved reading with you. See you next time.